Welcome back to Let's Tab 59. So, sort of late afternoon here, very calm day, a little bit overcast. Actually, it's a bit milder than I thought it was going to be. Hope you're all well. So it's a dodgy one in some respects. Now, I've always had an interest for years. As I say, I'm no historian, but I've always had an interest in some of the, sometimes you could call them forgotten conflicts, forgotten wars, if you like. I'm talking about all the small, that's the right term, all the small conflicts, emergencies, troubles that broke out after World War II, when the British Empire started to disintegrate, for want of a better word. So we had Palestine, we partitioned India, and all these little conflicts sort of fell out from that, and sort of domino effect, really, didn't they? Of course, we had the Korean War, which was quite a big one. But one that I'm interested in all of them, but one I want to talk to you about today is the Malayan Emergency. That's what it's called, the Malayan Emergency. And the reason it's quite an important one is because after World War II, all these little wars we had, so it's the late 40s, Malaya, for instance, was from 1948, Palestine was in the 40s as well, and went on. But all through the 40s, through the 50s, through the 60s, right up, we had all these little conflicts. And out of all of them, right up until the recent Middle East conflicts with Afghanistan and Iraq, out of all those little conflicts, wars, emergencies, what do you want to call them, the most casualties we took was in Malaya. The Malayan Emergency, 1,443 deaths, killed in action, much more wounded. So that's quite significant when you think how many casualties we took in Iraq and Afghanistan. You could put those two casualty statistics together and it's still a lot less than what happened in Malaya. And of course, there's still a lot of Malayan veterans around. And if any Malayan veterans are watching this, please give us a shout, give us some, maybe give something in the comments about your involvement in the Malayan Emergency. I'll be quite interested to hear from veterans. So, what happened? What's it all about? So, during the Second World War, let's start there. Obviously, we were struggling against the Japanese out in the Far East. And we had Malaya, that was part of our empire, mainly because we wanted the rubber. Rubber was important, especially during the war. So we were getting a lot of rubber out of Malaya. Japanese come along, think we'll have a bit of that detail, and they come in and start knocking us about. We trained up, the British that is, we trained up the local Malayans, the Malayan force, the Malayan soldiers. We trained them, we equipped them. We even decorated these guys after the war for their heroics. And they bravely fought off and defeated the Japanese in Malaya. After the war, we still got our fingers in the pie. But it's getting expensive. And we owed a lot of money from the Second World War. And the communists out there, which were a lot of Chinese, they decided they wanted to kick us out of Malaya because we weren't paying enough money for the rubber. We were just taking it, paying them peanuts. They took umbrage to that. I see why. And so they started sort of guerrilla war. And strangely enough, the guerrillas that were fighting for independence out there, there was a Malayan Communist Party. You had the Malayan National Liberation Army. Now these people, these soldiers, the whole lot totaled about 7,000 troops. Majority of those had been trained and equipped and were fighting on the side of the British back in the Second World War against the Japanese. And now they are in Malaya fighting against the colonial rule, the British. They started off by attacking these big rubber plantations because that's where we was getting our money from. They were headed up by British people, and obviously the workers in the plantations were locals, a lot of Chinese as well. And so they started attacking these and killing the plantation managers. So in 1948, the British went, right, hang on a minute, we've got a bit of trouble here. So Malayan Emergency, off you go. We started sending troops out there and to fight the guerrillas. So it went on from 1948 to 1960, quite a long while. So how did we counter it? Well, we had a lot of the locals, Malayan forces that were loyal to us, Malayan police force, etc., colonial police forces. They helped us. But we were throwing a lot of conscripts out, because this is 1948. Second World War's over. Yes, there were still some professional soldiers in the British Army, of course, but a lot of it was conscripts. So they were being thrown out there. What, they're getting 6 weeks training in the UK? Pass the basic training, off you go, son. Well, we totaled our forces out there. This is with other Commonwealth forces as well. So we had the British out there, we had the Malaysians fighting with us. And we had the Australians, we had the New Zealanders, Fiji, Kenya, some of the South Rhodesians were out there fighting with us. Kenya, as I say, all these different, and we totaled about over 450,000 troops out there. I think the British had about 13 battalions, half of which, or more than half of which, were Gurkhas. We even had an artillery unit out there at one time in the infantry role. So let's say that a lot of our troops weren't that experienced, and certainly not experienced in jungle warfare. I mean, some of these conscripts must have come straight out of the UK and never been abroad, maybe the Isle of Wight or something. Bang, they're out in the stinking jungles in Malaya. Horrible environment, anyone that's ever been out of the jungle fighting. So they're out there, and we're putting in ambushes. We couldn't fight it in a conventional war sense, so we had to go down into small units, patrols, if you like, platoons, and conduct patrols to try and disrupt, and also to protect the plantation, but try to disrupt the guerrillas' tactics. A lot of people say that Malaya was the British Vietnam, if you like. It's not quite the same. It wasn't as big. But anyway, there is parallels drawn between our Malayan conflict and the US and the Australians, New Zealanders out in Vietnam. One thing that is similar between the two conflicts is the use of defoliants, Agent Orange. A lot of you know about that bad boy. So if you don't, Agent Orange was a herbicide, a defoliant, it killed foliage, etc. And it was developed in America, quite a strong old chemical. And initially it was an industrial chemical. It was used in America to, they would spray it along railroads, vast railroads in America, to keep the foliage off the railway tracks, etc. That's what it was used for originally. Well, the British get hold of this and say, hang on, if we spray the jungle, we can deny areas, we can kill crops, we can deny the camouflage of the jungle, a bit like the Americans did afterwards. But we did it first. So we started to employ Agent Orange, and we sprayed it all over the place. So we used Agent Orange in that sense, in a conflict sense, in a war sense, before the United States did. So we started using Agent Orange, and of course, you know, most of you know that the outcomes of being exposed to that causes cancers, deformities in babies, and I think that's still happening now, both in Vietnam and out in Malaya. Horrendous chemicals. So we started using that. Then what we did was, to deny the guerrillas safe havens, if you like, we decided to round up these little villages and put them into, now, we called them new villages. Some people will call them concentration camps. I don't think it was a concentration camp in my mind, but we tried to get them in under a protective area. We let them out to go to work, to cut the plantations, to tap the rubber out of the trees. So they were allowed out, but they were constantly guarded so that the guerrillas couldn't go in there and get support, i.e. food or medical aid or whatever, shelter. So that was the idea of these new villages that we set up. And that's how we dealt with it. Now, back in 1948, when it first kicked off, there was a village out in Malaya called Batang Kali. I'd never heard of it till I sort of delved into the Malayan Emergency. Batang Kali. Now, a British unit, in fact it was the number 7 Platoon, G Company, 2nd Battalion the Scots Guards. And I believe the platoon was led by a platoon sergeant. I think it was two sergeants, so one was maybe acting as a platoon commander. I don't think they had an officer with them, and the other one was a platoon sergeant. And they got their platoon and they went into one of these villages suspected of harbouring terrorists. Not these new villages, this is a jungle village, Batang Kali. And they went in there, rounded up, separated the men and the women, the women and the children away from the men, and got all the men, interrogated them and that, and then shot 24 of them, executed 24 of these Malayan people from this village. Lined them up and shot them. It's a massacre. Now, later on in the Vietnam War, was it Malaya? I think the Americans had a massacre as well. And that one was quite well known, but this British one, at the time, was pretty much hushed up. Initially, the British, when it did come to light, the British were saying, no, these were communists and they were captured, we rounded them up and they started to run off into the jungle, and so our troops opened fire and killed them. But later evidence has come to light, not just recently, later after the event, that they were executed. And there was witness statements actually taken, I think in the 1970s, from soldiers that were there, veterans that were there when it happened. So it's a little bit of conflicting truth maybe, but there's a lot of weight behind the fact that it was a massacre done by the British, done by 2nd Battalion Scots Guards, or Platoon from G Company, 2nd Battalion Scots Guards. A documentary, I believe, was made in 1970. Various bits and pieces came out of it, and eventually they tried to get an inquiry. I think they petitioned our late Queen Elizabeth II, but nothing came back. They got nowhere with it. Documents were said to be lost or were archived away. So it's very difficult for these people, the survivors, the witnesses out in that village, the family survivors, to try and get any justice. They wanted an apology for the massacre, they wanted recognition of that, and of course they wanted financial reimbursement, if you like, for the deaths. But it didn't happen. And this went on. It dragged on. It started, I think, in the 70s, and it popped its head up again in the 80s, in 93, in 97, I think 2001, and it went on and on and on. And I think eventually in 2018, so not that long ago, in 2018, they took it to the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, but it got thrown out of that. There just wasn't enough evidence and it was too long ago. That's what the legal side said. And so to this day, as far as I know, this is 2024, nothing ever came back from the British government towards those people of Batang Kali to admit that it happened. But what of the soldiers that actually committed this shooting? As I say, there's witness statements from the soldiers saying, yes, they were lined up and shot. But I don't know what to do. I haven't seen all the evidence. Now, a lot of you on here are ex-soldiers or serving soldiers watching this, from not just UK, from other nations. And we like to think ourselves as professional soldiers, and that if we were in a similar situation and we were given that order just to line up people and shoot them, would we do it? Well, I certainly wouldn't. We all know it's against the Geneva Convention, the rules of armed conflict. It's just not the thing that's done. Now, atrocities happen in every war. Certainly since the Second War, since after the Second World War. There's instances, I believe there was some Australian SAS guys, at least one guy that's been committed or been found guilty of committing an offence. Obviously we had a couple of British, I think it was a Royal Marine, wasn't it, a sergeant, that was convicted at one time of shooting a wounded Afghanistan insurgent on the battlefield. So these things crop up all the time, and of course there's Bloody Sunday. You could argue that one. We've had trials from Northern Ireland for ex-soldiers being dragged up. But this one, to me, seems a lot different, because this is where, according to the statements, the villages were rounded up, the men were separated from the women and children, the men were then interrogated. I don't know if they were tortured, but they were certainly interrogated, and then they were shot. 24 of them. Apparently there was one more, I think it was 25, but one that survived fainted and then played dead amongst the bodies. So he actually survived it and gave a statement. And of course, the statements from the villagers, the women, and some of the children that witnessed it. But why did these lads from the Scots Guards, why did they pull the trigger? Do you think that, and please let me know in the comments, do you think that these were young conscripts, that they were scared, they were out in the jungle fighting, they were scared for their lives, they couldn't have been that well trained maybe if they were conscripts, first time out there, it was early days of the conflict, 1948, that's when it started. Do you think they were fearing for their own lives? Do you think they were angry because maybe they'd come under ambush themselves from these guerrillas and thought they wanted some sort of payback and thought, yes, you killed my mate Dave or whatever, you're getting it? Was it that? Was it that they were so scared of the hierarchy in that platoon, these sergeants, that when they were told to do it, jump, they say how high, and they just reacted? So was it like the discipline that had been the fear of their own sergeants, a hierarchy, that made them do it? Did all of the platoon open fire, or was it just a small number of them selected? How did it happen? I mean, did the platoon sergeants go, right, Smith, Jones, Frederick, whatever, over here, shoot them? I don't know. But it's worth looking into more. I'm certainly going to try and research this a bit further, because it seems an incredible atrocity to happen, and a big smear on the British Army, and a big smear on a famous regiment, the Scots Guards, terrifically famous regiment. And obviously the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards no longer exists. It's just one battalion now. I also heard rumours, and I don't think this was the Scots Guards, but I heard rumours that in some regimental museum or other, I don't think it's Scots Guards, in some regimental museum or other, there was fragments of skulls and things brought back and put into the regimental museum from the Malayan conflict, because there's other atrocities reported where there's pictures of, I think, a Royal Marine holding up 2 severed heads, one of a male and one of a female, and he's posing for the photograph with his 2 severed heads. When that was put to the Ministry of Defence, they said, the official line that come back from the British MOD was that when they were on deep operations out in the jungle, a couple of things happened. One was we had these IBAN mercenaries fighting for us. They were headhunters, and we'd employed them because they were great jungle trackers. And it was their tradition, if you like, that when they captured and killed an enemy, they would scalp them or decapitate them after they were dead. And so it was something that they'd done. It wasn't a British thing. So that's one. So there's no mention of British soldiers actually committing these decapitations. The other one reason they come back was something similar happened in Kenya in the Mau Mau uprising. Something similar. They were on deep operations in the jungle. They'd killed some terrorists, and they didn't have cameras with them to photograph these dead to see if they were important players in that guerrilla organisation. And so the heads were removed and brought back so they could be identified. Now, I don't know. That's the official line the Brits gave at the time. Now, getting back to Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising, I know that happened out there. Sometimes it happened by chop their hands off. Again, I don't think it was the British soldiers that did it. I think it was the locals that were fighting alongside the British. They would remove the hands and bring them back because they could then fingerprint them. So say it was a lot easier for them to bring a head back or some hands rather than the whole body through the jungle, because they could be, you know, it's like trying to move through the jungle. Anyone's been in the jungle, how difficult movement is, let alone trying to carry dead bodies. So the heads were brought back easier to carry. I don't know. It's a funny old subject, but it is a smear on the British Army. But things like that do happen in war. I mean, if you only got to look at conflicts like Bosnia, not from the British point of view, but the atrocities that were committed out there by the Serbs and the Croats on each other. And also out in, well, obviously out in Afghanistan and Iraq, beheadings were happening by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and whatever. And also, of course, in the Ukraine-Russian war, where there's atrocities being committed on both sides. just recently they reckon there's been up to 90 Ukrainians executed by Russian soldiers. We don't know the full stories yet. And this is the thing with it. There's always that fog of war around these incidences. Look at Bloody Sunday. You know, but this one stands out in particular in Malaya purely because, by all accounts, they were captured. They were rounded up, they were searched, they were no longer a threat. They were prisoners of war, technically, although it wasn't a war. In the eyes, it was an emergency. The British looking at it as a terrorist operation, anti-terrorist operation. But even so, we're still governed by rules of war. And just your own moral compass. I don't know. I wasn't there, so I don't know the pressures these soldiers were under that committed it. So, it's a little waffle on that. I want to do a few more on some of these small wars. Like I say, I'm no expert, and there's much better people out there on YouTube that can talk about these conflicts and show photographs and graphics everywhere and give you all the data. All I do is have a little bit of knowledge of some of the subjects and then come out for a tab, put my camera on and have a waffle to you about them. But I'm thinking about doing a few more like that. So we'll see how it goes. See how this video goes. I'll get a flavour from the amount of views it gets. So thanks for listening. If you're new to my channel and you haven't subscribed, please consider it. I'm not saying do it, I'm saying consider it. So that's all for me now. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Hey, I'm going for this lovely little avenue of trees. Have a quick look at this before I go. Look at that. Through the graveyard. That lovely little path going through. I'm going to walk back this way, I think. Okay, so that's enough from me then. So till the next time, troops, and it won't be long. Remember, stay safe. Less tab.